A few years ago, I began germinating every avocado pit from every avocado that I ate. There weren't really any nurseries nearby that sold avocado trees, and those that shipped from other parts of Spain were pretty expensive. So I figured I'd just germinate them myself. No toothpick method necessary, all it took was keeping them in a Tupperware, half covered in water, and sitting at our south facing kitchen windowsill. They easily sprang to life, and soon I ended up having dozens of young avocado trees. Now, I had read that avocado trees can take frosts up to 4 degrees below 0 Celsius. And since our most extreme overnight lows rarely, if ever, went underneath -1 degree, I confidently planted out all of those avocados. What I didn't know at the time was that some varieties could handle frosts, and mostly when they grow up and get larger. But young Hass avocados, which are the goose-bumped skinned variety that we're all getting from the supermarkets, do not like frosts at all. And so during the first winter after I had planted them all out, I was met with a rude awakening. I got out of bed, went outside, witnessed the frosty white blanket everywhere, and most of my avocados were killed off by that first strong frost of the year. I tried to shrug it off, leaning on the fact that I still had many avocados left in pots and protected. But it nagged at me. I didn't want it to happen again. So I came up with the idea of covering the few survivors that were left in little plastic tents and deciding on doing this with every young avocado tree from now on. And so, the following winter, with the previous year's memory of seeing those sensitive saplings with their yellow and orange tender young emerging leaves, blackened in the frosty morning, I made the effort to cover every single one of my young avocados. Knowing they were covered helped me sleep easier at night. But I still had the urgency to jump out of bed after any especially cold night and check how extensive the frost had been, see if any saplings had been affected. This mild paranoia led me to actually pay attention to when frosts happened, and I quickly noticed that it never really frosted until New Year's Eve, and only on very clear, cloudless nights, especially if there were multiple of them in a row. I saw that frosts were harder if they had had a few days in a row of non-rainy days. Because if there was lots of humidity at the ground level, it would create like this early morning fog that dampened the harsh cold. Sometimes there were light frosts in December, but really only in some patches in the topography where cold air accumulated. And I noticed that serious frosts, occurring for multiple days in a row, only really happened after the New Year. During those years, it used to be really hard for me to do things. Physical activities wore me out very easily. I found out eventually this had to do with chronic muscle tension related to CPTSD. This was especially the case during the colder months, especially with the shorter days, and this made me a procrastinator. And so, overconfident that it wouldn't frost until New Year's, I would usually wait until the end of December to work up the willpower to cover everything. I got away with that routine for a couple of years, but then one year, while we were still in the early half of December, and I wasn't yet thinking about making little plastic tents, we had an atypically strong frost one night. And so all the avocados got hit. Well, more so, I got hit. I felt unexpectedly distraught and upset. I howled, I yelled, I let out cries of rage and shame and guilt and frustration that rang out like the local chapel's bells across the village. I felt like it was my fault. I self-criticized. I should have been smarter, more prepared. How could I have been so stupid, so careless? What's curious about avocados is that even though they're thought of as tropical, they're more like mountain tropical. They love cool temperatures. And so we get a lot of growth in November and December here, especially with the unlimited water at that time of year. So those wonderful, youthful, tender spurts of late autumn growth were frost burned. I saw their young leaves twisted, and the older leaves blackened and eventually fall off. At the time, even though most didn't die, they just lost their top growth, it just felt like a huge loss, like a loss of progress and time. Soon after, I realized that this was my psychology. I was putting huge pressure on myself. I had a lot of parts in my psyche that needed some sort of feeling of accomplishment or getting things done to prop up my ego. The avocados gave me a window into some of my core relational traumas, feelings of scarcity, and the hyper-judgmental upbringing that I received. The plants offered me a mirror that showed me many of these issues. First off, something I inherited from my mother was the inability to feel responsible for any harm or death that may come to any being that I'm responsible for. When an immature psyche has another being in its care, and it comes to harm or dies, what often occurs is a feeling of enormous guilt, like they are in trouble or in danger, rather than a true feeling of grief and loss. Another thing I realized, if I'm honest with myself, was that losing the avocados was like a blow to my self-esteem. I was known as the forest guy. It was my way of receiving attention or getting work. So having them die felt like a failure and a loss of face for my forest garden teacher persona. And it awakened a fear that people wouldn't take me seriously if I failed. Losing the avocados also brought me face to face with the anger of not getting what I want. That young, frustrated child anger. And rightfully so. That child I have inside feels abandoned, and his needs have been unmet. And he just wants things to go right for him for once, so that he can finally be loved and cared for. His reaction, still immature, is often, "Why can't I just have something I want? I'm trying to do this for a good cause, rather than happily accepting a consumer lifestyle like everyone else. Why am I not being helped?" Another thing I went through was that losing those trees triggered my psychology of lack and scarcity, of not being able to rely on others and get what I need. Planting those avocados symbolized being able to provide for myself and not have to rely on the system for getting the things I needed. Another thing the avocados reminded me of was my infant trauma. Going way back into my development, I was an incubator baby, and I think that I identified with those young saplings as young, helpless beings who couldn't withstand the elements without the help of a plastic shield, the way I couldn't either. The frost damage also revealed to me my inability to let go, to feel sad, unable to express how much they meant to me, how much I cared about them. Rather than grief, I felt howlingly upset, because at that time my nervous system still associated sadness and loss with danger, and so the experience of losing beings important to me felt triggering and overwhelming. Still another mirror that I realized is that the covering of the avocados also satisfied an "I want it now" kind of urge. I definitely had an urgent feeling of wanting the avocados to grow as fast as possible and an unwillingness to lose branches or leaves during the winter, which would be a setback to their growth and a setback to getting big enough for them to start producing. And finally, the last issue that I saw through the avocados was that as an activity, making those little tents gave me a simple purpose that my trauma brain could handle during the winter months, where I could barely think or figure things out. So it felt empowering. Like in spite of not being fully functional, there was something I could do to improve my station in a simple and straightforward way that didn't require a depth of feeling or planning ability. So, over the years, I've been coming to these realizations about myself as to what is really going on in my unconscious surrounding this activity of covering avocado trees. It has been a sort of annual rite of passage into winter, one last job to close the year with. It also has always marked a time when I'm denser, more isolated, less conscious, somewhat depressed because of having to spend so much more time indoors. I used to cover them manically, sometimes even covering the already tall ones, creating comically large plastic pyramids. Gradually, observation gave me a sense for the point at which the avocados were large enough to fly on their own. Somewhere between 2 and 3 meters, depending on their trunk's girth, and most importantly having developed brown bark, which keeps the trunk protected so that even if the leaves and branches are damaged, the tree remains after a frost. I remember seeing somewhere that the wild mother archetype knows how to care for life. She knows when to set it free, to survive on its own, and she also knows when to let things die, when it's time to let go. The avocados have been a small lesson in learning this discernment, and have taught me that loving is not about grasping or being overprotective or feeling guilt, but fully bonding and taking responsibility when one is a caretaker, fully feeling the sadness and grief when time comes to move on, and accepting mistakes and imperfection. What's funny about all this is that I don't even know if my efforts will pay off. Everyone tells me that ungrafted avocados aren't worth having because they won't be productive, but I believe in genetic diversity and giving trees a chance from seed. And then there's the climactic factor. We live at 41 degrees latitude. This is the same as Minnesota, Ukraine, Mongolia. Our mild winters rely on the Gulf Stream, which climate change is destabilizing. And so if the Gulf Stream ever goes, so does our nice avocado climate. So, caring for the avocados has been a lesson in trusting my intuition, following through on my own ideas, rather than letting naysay or pessimism make me feel like what I'm doing is wrong or not worth trying. I have come to honor that this is the way I had of doing things. Looking back, even the smallest things seemed so daunting to me back then. Everything was a struggle. Learning to graft was nearly impossible, as focus and dexterity with the knife literally felt painful because I was spending so much energy repressing trauma at the time. And then relating to people that could do it for me felt too hard. Every contact felt like it had so many strings attached. People made me tired. And then the option of making money to buy grafted trees seemed to me as hard as climbing the Matterhorn. So starting avocados from seed felt empowering. Like, in spite of my disabilities, I could find a way to achieve a goal on my own, since interacting with the outside world to achieve it felt too overwhelming. So even though I was making this decision from parts or subpersonalities, from a fear of the world, such is the paradox of life that it led me towards greater awareness and understanding of my inner and outer nature, and faced me with my aforementioned issues that were stirred up and reflected through the relationship of caring for these avocados. Furthermore, their experience led to a maturation of my mother archetype, learning a healthy balance of being neither overprotective nor indifferent, knowing when to move on, but also knowing when to do a little extra care to keep something alive. And so, coming back to that season where I cover avocados, this year I haven't even procrastinated. It's early December and I've covered everything already. When this time of the year comes around, my muscles usually get stiffer, and the act of twisting my body and stretching my arms to get the plastic has always felt exhausting. But this year I feel so much lighter and it's become so much easier. In the past, putting up the plastics had always been a sign that winter, and thus the hardest months of the year for me, were beginning. Hence, I think that's why I always waited until the last second. As long as the avocados were uncovered, I could still act like it was a pleasant autumn. I think I've finished early this year as a way of accepting that winter and whatever else is coming along with it is approaching. And I'm hoping that whatever else will be a meaningful activity, time spent in community, life. It's been a way of liberating myself having everything covered. I am now free for the winter with no major commitments to the forest garden, and I'm hoping this means opportunities to travel and connect more with people. Something I haven't done in years. I'd like to start reaching out to other artists and regenerators, to collaborate with those whose work may be compatible with my own, part of a common ecosystem. And maybe next year I'll be so involved in Livio gaming as a cultural village experimentation enterprise that covering avocados with plastic won't even be on my mind. I will have healed the underlying guilt that was a great part of the motivation for covering the avocados, and the desire to just keep them from dying will have become a sensation of, I know you can do it, I trust the most resilient and willing The ones meant to be will make it. Furthermore, the forest has been getting bigger and bigger every year, meaning more microclimate pockets where there are no frosts. And so I hope to be entrusting these little guys to the forest garden, allowing me to go and serve Gaia in another way. And what I hope, deep down, is that my winters won't be about simply hoping there won't be loss, just trying to avoid disaster and watching over trees. But I hope to transition into winter activities that come from a feeling of togetherness and serving the future, where what is being protected is the communities of the future.